joining us. It's our first session of In Conversation in 2024, and it's a very special session, as Elise mentioned, in advance of International Holocaust Remembrance Day. Guido, I would like to, offer a huge welcome and thank you for enriching our understanding of the Holocaust through your family's journey. And I'm going to turn it over to you in just a moment, but before I do, I wanted to briefly summarize your life journey for our audience. Okay, so Guido Smit was born in 1945, just at the end of the Second World War, in the British Mandate of Palestine. In 1949, following Israel's War of Independence, his parents moved back to the Netherlands, and at the age of 3.5, Guido chose to go with them. At 21, Guido emigrated to Canada, and following a career in the high-tech sector, mostly managing Canadian subsidiaries of US firms, Guido retired in 2003. One of his major retirement activities has been as a Holocaust educator, at first at UJA's Chaim and Sarah Neuberger Holocaust Education Center. And I would say that his role as an educator is tied to his personal story as a child who was born in the immediate aftermath of the Second World War, and as the child of both a Jewish survivor of the Holocaust and a rescuer. So this is a fascinating a narrative and testimony. Guido, we're thrilled to hear from you today. And so we're gonna now turn over to Guido to provide a little bit of insight into that testimony. And from there, we will have a bit of discussion, conversation. And yes, if you have questions, please feel free to put them into the chat. So Guido, thank you very much. I'll share your slides and you can begin whenever you are ready.
Great. All right, there we go. Okay, thank you, Elena, for the introduction. And thank you to everyone and welcome for being here. Good afternoon or good evening, depending on the time zone from which you dialed in. So in the past, my presentations have been to high school groups describing the general story of the Holocaust, the rising of Nazism, how the Holocaust came about, some of the main events, some statistics, and I would only mention in passing the fact that my parents were part of a Dutch underground resistance group, only to indicate that there was resistance. Today, we have an opportunity to drill down on the particular story of that resistance group in the Netherlands. It's overwhelmingly a Dutch story, although not exclusively. And so what we have on the screen is the map of the Netherlands, Holland, Belgium, and Luxembourg. And in the top right-hand corner, northeast corner of the Netherlands, you'll see a site called Westerbork. That was the main transit camp from which the Jews in Holland were deported to camps in the east, primarily Auschwitz and Sobibor, and also Bergen-Belsen and a few others sometimes. So that's one of the three locations around which the story will revolve today. In the upper left side, it's not indicated on the map as such, but north of the city called Alkmaar, which is north of Amsterdam, there was a Jewish training camp for Jewish youngsters called Wieringen, and we'll talk a little bit about that, because that's where my mother entered the story. Just to set the stage a little bit, in 1933, when the Nazis took power in Germany, the Dutch Jewish population was about 100,000 Jews. And they had been in the Netherlands for about 500 years, and they were a very comfortable part of Dutch society. In the subsequent 6 years leading up to the start of the Second World War, in September of 1939, another 40,000 Jews left from Germany at first and subsequently Austria after the Anschluss to the surrounding countries, wherever they could get, just to get out of Germany. And 40,000 of those came to the Netherlands. So the total population at the beginning of the war, the Jewish population was about 140,000. One of those 40,000 was my mother. So she was born and raised in a city called Breslau, which after the war, when the borders shifted westward, it became Wrocław in Poland. But when she grew up, it was part of Germany. She was 18 years old in August of 39, 2 weeks before the war broke out, when she got to the Netherlands. So as the war came closer, Jewish charitable organizations and Jewish youth organizations were desperately trying to get as many people out as they could, particularly focusing on the younger generation. And the proposition to governments like in the Netherlands was, because remember that the Great Depression was still going at that time, unemployment was still a major issue. The proposition was, don't worry, let us bring them in. They will not take away Dutch jobs. We will finance them, we will look after them, we will train them for jobs that we need to be fulfilled in the British Mandate of Palestine, which became Israel. They won't take away Dutch jobs, and within 2 years, we'll get them out of your hair. That was a nice promise, except that, first of all, the Brits controlled the British Mandate of Palestine, and they were very reluctant to let in any significant Jewish immigration because they didn't want to upset the Arab population. And then secondly, once the Germans overran all of Western Europe, you couldn't get out. So they were stuck in Holland and in the other countries. So in the first slide, we see the main building of this one camp that I was referring to in Wieringen. Ellen, I don't know if we can move it to the next slide. So the Jewish youth organization, Hashemia Atzair, together with the commissioner, the High Commissioner for Refugees for the League of Nations, David McDonald, persuaded the Dutch authorities to make this facility, which was a agricultural testing station, available to house a training camp, or Hachshara camp in Hebrew, where they would teach youngsters primarily from Germany and Austria to learn the trades that they would be useful once they got to Palestine. So they were referred to as Palestine pioneers. So we're talking about agriculture, carpentry, mechanics, not typical Jewish trades and professions in the diaspora. My mother's parents were both pharmacists, and many of these children came from such middle-class professional families, doctors, lawyers, and so on. But in Israel, they weren't going to need quite so many of those. So they built a number of barracks around this building, and the total camp consisted of about 330 youngsters. And on the next slide, we see some of the training going on of agricultural activities, so low hothouses. So that was one of the activities that they were being taught. So imagine 330 youngsters fled from Germany and Austria, having left their families behind. The dark clouds of the war were just getting darker and coming closer, worried about their families, relatively little supervision, teenagers. So very, very special kind of setting. And of course, a lot of friendships and very special bonds were formed. First 9 months after my mother arrived, which was 2 weeks before the war broke out, nothing happened, even though the war had started in Poland. Then in May of 1940, the Germans overran Holland, Belgium, Luxembourg, and the northern part of France. Now, in the First World War, the Netherlands had managed to stay out of the war. So people who were in Holland had hoped that in the Second World War too, Holland would be able to stay out. Well, that didn't fit with the German plans. They wanted to control the entire European coastline. So Holland was occupied along with the other countries. Obviously a shock to the Dutch population, a very big shock to the Jewish population, and certainly for these youngsters who had fled from Germany and Austria. This was a very, very scary moment. But for the next 9 months, actually nothing happened. Life went on, and the Germans were just collecting information until February of 1941, when suddenly they showed up with a whole bunch of buses, and they took 300 of the 330 youngsters to Amsterdam, told them to register with the Jewish Council. When we want you, we will let you know. Clearly, they understood what that meant. That didn't mean we want to have a cup of coffee with you. these youngsters were then housed with Jewish families in Amsterdam. And of course, they realized where this was leading. And so now the hunt was on for hiding places when it became necessary, and false documents and so on. So there evolved a Dutch resistance group, mixed Jewish, non-Jewish, to prepare for that time. The 30 youngsters who stayed behind broke down the camp, cleaned it up, and then they too were joined the rest of the community in Amsterdam. A very anxious time, waiting for, for worse things to come. Now, in parallel, in the next slide refers to this, was another such training facility, a much smaller group, about 48 youngsters and their leaders. Again, mostly teenagers, ages 15 to 19, being prepared for jobs later on in Israel, brushing up their Hebrew, learning about Palestine, and learning these trades with farmers in the neighborhood. I think the next slide shows a group of the youngsters as well. If maybe we can bring that up. There we are. So a group photo of those 48 youngsters. They were led by a very charismatic young leader called Shushu. He had come from Germany. He was all of 22 years old, brilliant young man, and very charismatic. He had actually been in Buchenwald in a German concentration camp. He had managed to get out during an amnesty in the late 30s. So he knew from personal experience just how vicious and nihilist the Nazi program was. He had no illusions about what was to come. Now, not very far from this particular facility, which was just north of Utrecht, right in the center of the Netherlands, was a very avant-garde school. It was known as the Werkplaats, or the workplace, sort of Montessori-like in its approach. And somebody made a connection between 4 or 5 of the teachers there and Shushu and the leadership of this particular group to talk about what was to come. And Shushu laid out the concern and said, we must hide these youngsters when the time comes, because the Germans will start deporting them, and once they are caught, then that will be the end of them. So these teachers immediately said, fantastic, this is what we're going to do. Yes, we're going to help and find hiding places. So each of them undertook to take responsibility for a certain territory in the Netherlands, even though it's a very small country. There were 11 provinces. And everybody had friends in certain parts of the country, people that they were close to, they felt they could trust. So they made arrangements. And through good contact in the Jewish Council, they knew that the Germans planned to raid this school on August 15, 1942. And in the 3 preceding nights, they took during each of those nights, they arranged to take about 1/3 of those youngsters and take them to hiding places, in the nearby vicinity, and then later on took them to other addresses that were promised to be a bit more permanent. So the next slide, my apologies. Okay, so on the next slide, I have the faces for some of the members of the group, not all of them. I couldn't find pictures for everyone, but I thought it might be useful and helpful to tie some faces to names. So the group became known as the Westerweel group after the leader of the group was Joop Westerweel. It was not a hierarchical group. It wasn't as though somebody reported to somebody else, but just informally, Joop was the leader. He was 18 years older than most of the others. He was very, very charismatic, and tremendous organizational skills. Wil Westerweel, his wife, she was 9 years younger than Joop, 9 years older than most of the others, including my father. So they really were the linchpin of this group, if you will. And they were part of that meeting, as was the next page you see, Bouke Koning. So Bouke and Joop and Wil and my father were at this initial meeting where Shushu laid out the problem, and they immediately agreed to take on the challenge. Bauke and Joop, much later in the war, were arrested when they were crossing the border with two young Jewish girls to smuggle them to Belgium, intending to take them to France. They were arrested, the girls were arrested. As it turned out, the two girls survived after a terrible trail. And in fact, the niece of one of those girls, I believe, is on a call with us today. Joop was executed before the Germans left the Netherlands. Bauke was shipped off to the east, went through a number of concentration camps, Roos and Dora, and a number of others, and came back. He did survive, but only just. And he was bedridden for about 5 years after the war. He was really damaged badly. Wil was also arrested, and she went to Ravensbrück, also survived just, and did come back. She was far and away my favorite aunt. What I might have mentioned in my introduction is I feel that my childhood was very privileged, not economically, on the contrary, we were quite poor, but it was a real privilege for me to have grown up with these people, essentially as my aunts and uncles, because they were very, very special people. And Wil was far and away my favorite aunt. She was just amazing. She lived to a ripe old 91, and in fact, every time I was in the Netherlands, I would visit her, and I saw her just a few weeks before she passed away at 91. Gerda Loef was a very young student of Joop. She was very artistic, so part of her work, as well as hiding people together with her fiancé, Pim, was to help with the forging of documents. And she also was one of my aunts. On the next slide, we have a few more faces. I mentioned there was the Amsterdam group that had grown out of the group from Wieringen and their preparation for the time to go underground. And then there was this Loosdrecht group that I mentioned, which is, and by the way, I apologize, these names cannot be pronounced unless you happen to be Dutch. And so that Loosdrecht group was what my father was originally part of. The groups met sometime in early 43. And as it turned out, my father was one of the main bridges between the two groups. So Frans Gerritsen, the name you see on the far left, he was a commercial artist. He became, after the war, a worldwide authority on colors. And so one of the things he did was to forge documents. He also devised a very, very clever coding system so they could keep information on everyone and who was where with an unbreakable code. And he and his wife Henny had many people staying at their house in hiding. Tine Schabbing was a smuggler. He used to smuggle tobacco across the border between Holland and Belgium. And then my father and the others said, how'd you like to smuggle for real and smuggle people? So it's fantastic. And he was a great guy and did fantastic work. He did survive the war as well. Died just a few years ago. He was a fabulous guy. Then we have a picture of my father, Guido Smit. So he came from a working class family. In Holland, you were obliged legally to stay in school until age 14, and then you went to work. And he did, to contribute to the family income. He became a bricklayer. So very little formal education, but he was very much a self-educated man with a very wide self-education. And he became a teacher, shop teacher, and maintenance part of this special school, and therefore he ended up being part of this group at the initial meeting with Shushu. And for him, he grew up in a pacifist, socialist, humanist environment, very frustrated by the German occupation, which was harsh and arbitrary, and the Dutch prized their freedom. They banned newspapers and replaced the civil administration. Who were these guys? But resisting violently was not in his nature, but it also didn't make a lot of sense. If you took a pot shot at a German, they'd wind up 10 civilians and shoot them. So that didn't make any sense. So when this opportunity presented itself for him and for the others, this was actually a relief. Finally, they knew what it was that they could do to thwart the Germans, do something wonderful and positive without using violence. So it was for them, it was a great release to be able to do this. Sushi, I already mentioned. Once the period came where they had their youngsters in hiding, he then went and organized escape routes out of the Netherlands. What is not often appreciated is that each of the occupied countries under German occupation was managed very differently. And in Holland, it was very tightly controlled. The Germans, as I just mentioned, they replaced the civic administration, they put in their own people, they brought in their own police force, the Groene Politie. It was very tightly controlled, so it was very difficult to move around. In contrast, for example, in France, leaving aside the Vichy collaborationist government in the south, was managed with only 1,500 German officers. They left the French administration in place. So it was much looser and much easier to get around and find hiding places. So Sushi made contacts looking for an escape route into Switzerland. Ultimately, what he settled on was an escape route to Spain, which, although it was under the dictatorship of Franco, who was a fascist dictator who got to power with the help of Hitler and Mussolini, he played the game very cagily, and he didn't really help the Germans materially. And once Jewish refugees managed to get across the Pyrenees into Spain, they were actually safe. Now, very sadly, on his way back from the Pyrenees and meeting with the French resistance, he was arrested at the border coming back into Holland. And since he had been in Buchenwald, as I mentioned, he knew what their methods were. He knew too much about the group and who was doing what and who was hidden where. He carried poison and he killed himself. So it was a very black moment for the group at age 23. So a very, very sad day for the group. A few more faces of a few more members of the group. Max Windmüller on the left was a German Jewish member of the group, a youth leader. He was actually on the ship, the Dora. It was the last ship to leave Rotterdam for Palestine. And at the last minute, he decided to stay and help looking after Jewish youngsters in the Netherlands. I'll come back to his story a little later on. Laura Durlacher, a German Jewish girl who came to the Netherlands as well. She was actually my father's girlfriend, and they were living together until my mother came along and stole him. Very, very courageous young woman, and she helped with taking people to hiding places. I'll talk a little later about the smuggling of people out of Westerbork, and she participated in that. She got through the war okay. Her son and I are very, very close friends, and we had breakfast just recently in Israel. Kurt Reilinger, another Jewish youngster who was part of the group, and particularly in France, which I'll talk about in just a sec. He and Max and a few others. He also ended up in Auschwitz, but he did come back, and then very sadly was killed in a car accident immediately after the war in Holland. He was hitchhiking late at night, and in the dark he was hit. Henk Brusse on the far right was a Dutch architect. And he was doing all by himself what the rest of the group were doing. He was looking after a number of people. He had hiding places for them. He had excellent connections in the police force, so he knew who was collaborationist with the authorities and who could actually be relied upon to help the underground. But he was doing it all by himself, which was very high risk, of course, if something happened to him and the people he was looking after would have been stranded. So he and my father collided, and they agreed to collaborate to back each other up. And tragically, that turned out to be the wise move, because he was ultimately arrested, also shipped east, and he did not survive the Gross-Rosen concentration camp. So just let me turn to the Westerbork. So as I mentioned, this was a camp in the northeastern corner of the Netherlands, very remote area by Dutch standards. It was a camp that was built by the Dutch authorities before the war to house German refugees. Originally, they planned to build it near Apeldoorn, closer to the center of the country, but it happened to be close to where the Queen of Holland, Wilhelmina, had her castle, and she didn't want a refugee camp close to her palace, and certainly not Jewish refugees. So they built it in this remote location. So when the Germans occupied the Netherlands, they took that camp and turned it into the Dulag or Durchgangslager, or transit camp for Dutch Jews. When they were rounded up, they were shipped to Westerbork. And then every Tuesday, a train would leave from Westerbork to Auschwitz or Sobibor or Bergen-Belsen or Theresienstadt, whatever the destination was. Typically, it was about 1,000 inmates who were shipped, or prisoners. Sometimes the load was doubled, and there were 2,000. So on Monday, the list became known. Of course, absolute panic, because people understood fairly early on if you were shipped to the east, that was not good. Even in the beginning, they didn't understand about the gas chambers. That did become known a little later on in the war. So absolute pandemonium and panic. I'll point out a couple of the characters on the slide. Two gentlemen on the left slide with white armbands, and on the right picture, you also see someone with a white armband. So that meant they were members of the Ordnungsdienst, the group that kept order in this process, throughout the camp, and particularly in this Tuesday process of getting people onto the trains. When any one of the youngsters who the group had in hiding, sometimes they were discovered and arrested and sent to Westerbork. Then the group tried to get them out. So how did they do that? If you were one of those prisoners, the group would let you know. They had contact with the Dutch underground. I'll talk about that in a moment. With the Jewish underground inside Westerbork, you would volunteer to go onto the train, and you'd be given one of these armbands that you had in your pocket. Then on Tuesday, you would present yourself, you would be ticked off the list, you would get on the train, and then in the chaos, you would slip on the band, so now you look like you were someone of the Ordnungsdienst helping arrange things. You'd sneak out and you hide in one of the barracks. And then the next day or so, you would join one of the work commandos that worked outside the camp, and then somebody from the group, my father or one of the other members, would be there to catch you and take you to another safe address. So now on the next slide is an interesting little story about how the group maintained contact with the Jewish underground in the camp. So I mentioned that when Wieringen was eliminated, there were 30 youngsters who stayed behind to help clean up, and then later they rejoined the group in Amsterdam. One of those was a mechanic, Kurt Walter, and the commandant of the camp in Wieringen got to know him and got to trust him. And later on, that commandant became the commandant of the Westerbork camp. So he appointed Kurt Walter to be the machinist on this little train that you see in the picture here. For those who are familiar with the Netherlands, you'll know that it's a waterlogged country, and much of the transport of goods happens through canals with shallow boats. And there was such a canal, the Oranje Canal, that ran about 8, 9, 10 kilometers away from Westerbork. And there was this miniature train that you see in the picture here that ran between Westerbork and the canal. And Kurt Walter would drive this train to the canal, get whatever goods were being shipped to the camp, and drive back to the camp. And they trusted him, so he could stop along the way and meet with the members of the underground group, my father and the others, and talk about the plans, who they were going to smuggle out the next time, prepare papers for them, and of course they could give packages of food and so on and so forth. Kurt survived the war as well. He just passed away just a couple of years ago in Israel, and it's just a wonderful, wonderful story. The next slide. So apart from Jews being rounded up and shipped to death camps in the east, and of course underground people who were captured and were sent to the camps east as well, the Germans also had razzias or raids where they rounded up Dutch, mostly male workers to do slave labor in Germany for German industry. And of course, lots of Dutchmen really didn't want to get caught in those razzias. So a couple of local farm boys in the vicinity of the camp had made this hiding place that you see in the picture here in the forest. If there are any Dutch-speaking people in the audience, it's known as a plaggenhut. And so my father and his colleagues, when they would come to Westerbork to catch someone who was being smuggled out, they would stay with these guys until the time had come to go to the camp and get the people out. Now, I mentioned earlier that Holland was being very, very tightly managed, and France was much looser. So they developed a plan to, where possible, to smuggle people from Holland through Belgium to France. And so they set up a branch office in Paris, and the next slide shows a couple of pictures relevant to that story. So on the left, you see a picture of Paula Kaufmann. Paula was another German Jewish girl who had come to the Netherlands. She went down to France, to Paris, and managed to get a job as a secretary with the Gestapo headquarters in Paris, where she had access to letterhead and stamps. And the Germans are very fond of letterhead and stamps. So she could create documents that when anybody was brought from Holland down to Paris, they could provide them with papers that would allow them to work on construction sites like the Atlantic Wall that was being built along the French coast, where you would be relatively safe. She also managed to create a document for Max Windmüller. You saw a picture of him a little bit earlier, which made him a senior officer in the Sicherheitsdienst. This is the internal intelligence group, internal affairs group within the SS. So even the SS guys were scared of these people, and certainly any military officers backed off when Max would be challenged, and he showed them his Sicherheitsdienst card. Unfortunately, late in the war, the group was betrayed, the whole group in Paris, and so they all were shipped to Auschwitz. Paula did survive, but Max, unfortunately, did not survive the death marches after the liberation, or after they evacuated Auschwitz. So in September of 1944, the Dutch railroad workers all went on strike. There was no more railroad traffic. So there were no more deportations from Westerbork. Whoever was there was stuck there. And transportation within Holland became very, very difficult. So the job of the group became one of just maintaining whoever was in place and looking after them with food parcels and so on and so forth. And to get people to France and get them down to into the hands of the French resistance to help them get across the Pyrenees. So in the next picture is the identity card of my father as a member of the French underground, showing the Paris address of the group as his home base, and that became part of what the group did. Now, a few months before this, Bauke and Joop, as I mentioned, had been arrested, and so the group got together. As you see in the next slide, a few pictures. The remainder of the group members got together in a remote area in the Netherlands called Neuberger in a forest during a holiday weekend to talk about how to manage themselves after these arrests and make their plans. And they also had the opportunity to get together, and you see the group dancing the hora and having some games like walking upon the beam. And the last picture of the penultimate picture of my slide presentation, the group managed to save about 270 youngsters through the war. 70 of those they managed to get across the Pyrenees into Spain, and here you have a picture of many of those. And they actually managed to get from Spain to Palestine already in 1944. In 1964, in the early 1960s, Israel had founded Yad Vashem, as the Holocaust Museum and Memorial, and also as the vehicle through which the State of Israel would recognize appreciation for what they are called the righteous among the nations, Chasidei Olam, those people who were not Jewish, but helped Jewish people during the war at complete risk to their lives without being compensated for it. So the Westerveld group were among one of the earlier groups to be so recognized. And in the next slide, we have Bill Westerveld receiving her certificate from Gideon Hausner, who had become very famous, of course, as the prosecutor of Adolf Eichmann. So the group was invited to Israel. In Yad Vashem, there is a large territory called the Guardian of the Righteous, where they've planted olive trees to honor many of the righteous who are recognized. And there are two trees there actually associated with this group. One is dedicated to Job and Vil as the linchpins of the group, and then one dedicated to the group. And there's a plaque with a number of names, and my father's name is one of those. After the war, my mother was pregnant with me just. My father's connections with the French underground led to connections with the Jewish Brigade, who were then posted in Belgium and the Netherlands. And through that, he was able to get a certificate for my mother so she could go to Palestine legally. And survivors from the Wieringen group had agreed. Now, one slide back, please. There should be a slide in between. Had agreed that those who survived would go to Palestine and they would form a kibbutz. So they did get together in an existing kibbutz called Hazareya, where they continued their training on how to run a kibbutz. And that's where I was born. And I thought there was a picture of my mother with me as a very tiny baby, 78 years ago. So that is really my slide presentation. So I've had a lot of time to think, of course, about what made these people so special. In some ways, they were very ordinary. My father was a bricklayer. A couple of them were teachers. Some were artists. One of them became a well-known Dutch author. One was a smuggler, as I mentioned. But what really set them apart was their moral clarity. They knew what was right or wrong. They didn't care what anyone else said or thought or did. They knew what was right or wrong, and they had the courage to act accordingly. They knew it was wrong for Jewish people, in this case, to be persecuted the way they were, and it was just wrong, and they had to do something about it. So they really showed moral leadership and social responsibility. Clearly, they were willing to sacrifice themselves, and a number of them did not make it. It took real courage to do this. The Germans were evil, but they weren't stupid, so it took real ingenuity to find ways around the systems, and the Germans were forever changing the documentation that was needed. So you had to be clever. Obviously, they had compassion for their fellow human beings, and they had to be able to cooperate with one another and completely trust each other. So integrity and cooperation were key features. I already mentioned there was no hierarchy. Nobody was in charge other than through sheer force of personality. Joop was the leader. There were a number of resistance groups throughout Europe, of course. What was not so typical, there were others, but it was not so typical, was for Jews and non-Jews to do this work seamlessly together. And also, there were many groups where women had roles, but very often they were, the cooks and the nurses. In this group, the women did exactly what the men did. It was seamless. As I mentioned at the beginning, most of my presentations have been to high school groups, so I talk about some of the key lessons that I try to impress upon the youngsters, and I have them on the next slide. Treat every person as an individual and not as a member of a group. And that's really what underlay the Nazi philosophy. They didn't care if Jews converted to Christianity. That made no difference. They were Jews. They belonged to the Jewish group or the Gypsy group, Sinti and Roma, as we would say today, or Slavs, and they were subhuman, and therefore they could do what they wanted with them. They didn't care about the individual. The other thing I press upon the youngsters is how careful we must be with words and images. When the Turks went after the Armenians in the First World War, they didn't call them Armenians, they called them vermin. And when the majority Hutus in Rwanda went after the Tutsis, and many of us will remember that, they didn't call them Tutsis, they called them cockroaches. And the Germans were very good at this. So in the cinema, they would show movies with hundreds and hundreds of rats crawling in the sewer, and then the picture would dissolve, and you would see hundreds of very ill-looking and poorly dressed Jews in the ghettos. So, you know, they may look like people, but they're not like us. Recognize when, you know, some people are vulnerable and are not in a position to help themselves. And being silent, and I think that's very pertinent to what's going on today, it can be dangerous. And when it comes to the Holocaust, do not forget, but do educate. So that's my presentation. But of course, given what happened on October 7th, I can't help but make a couple of comments. I simply could not go to Israel, so I went for 6 weeks to volunteer and do whatever it was that I could, which is, you know, minuscule. But 360,000 reservists were called up, and before the war against Hamas, there were 24,000 guest workers from Thailand in the agricultural sector, some of whom were captured and made into hostages, some were murdered. So half of those Thai workers went back home, understandably. So I knew there was just an enormous amount of work that needed to be done, and wherever I could help. So this is what I did. It's a very somber time. We are all, I think, a little bit broken by what happened. But it was an amazing thing to be there and see how the society is coming together. Forget about the government, forget about all the tensions, the volunteer work and everybody contributing in some way or other. And you know, I have profound friendships there as a result of what happened during the war. You know, those friends put me up when I went there to help. And it was a morale boost that people would come from overseas and come and help. And I don't want to end on a somber note, so I want to tell one quick story, a positive story. A few days after I got to Israel, I ran into friends of friends, and they heard about how I had arrived and some of the volunteer activity that I had identified doing agricultural work at the farms close to the Gaza border, because those farmers were desperate to bring in their harvest and they didn't have people to help. And then there's some of activities like that. And then they bumped into an American who had shown up with exactly the same idea, not Jewish, not connected to Israel at all, but he had seen what had happened and how everyone was piling onto Israel. And he said, this is wrong and I got to go and help. But he was frustrated, he didn't know what to do. And so these friends of mine who heard about what I had done said, well, we met this Canadian guy and he just figured it out, so you should talk. So for the next 5 weeks, this gentleman and I think he is on the call today as well, went around Israel doing some of these volunteer jobs, working in agriculture near Gaza, working for an organization called Latet, packaging food for families that needed it, internal evacuees, and so on and so forth. So just a tremendous show of solidarity in this very, very, very tough and terrible time. So that's my story. And if there are any questions, I would love to hear.
Thank you so much, Guido. And, you know, I think what you've just said, it certainly reminds me, and I think it connects very much with the testimony, you know, your father's story and the other members of the Westerville group, that, you know, in times of trouble, we see, you know, the darkest side of humanity, as well as, you know, the incredible courage and, you know, the fact that we need to look for the helpers. We need to focus on how we can come together and support one another in these times. And there are a couple of questions, very insightful questions here in the chat. So maybe we'll start there. So one question is, the Westerwelle group appears to have been infiltrated by the Germans. So do you have any information on how this happened, or what's the biggest thing there?
Well, so somebody, a number of the Jewish members of the group chose to, instead of going into hiding, to play an active role. So one of the girls who was in this Loosdrecht group, and you saw the group picture of the 48 youngsters, was a young woman called Letty Rudelsheim. And she was initially in hiding, and they said, no, I want to do some work. Give me an assignment. So they set up what they thought was a safe house in Rotterdam. And so they would use that as a transit point for people who needed to be taken from one address to another. In fact, I mentioned earlier about the girl who was smuggled across the border and then was arrested, and I think her niece is on the call today. Well, in fact, her father, meaning the younger brother of the girl who was arrested, he was one of those youngsters who was being moved from place to place, and it happened on 2 occasions that my father moved him around, including to this safe house, and then he was moved on to a safe place in the south of the Netherlands, in Limburg. Well, at some point, the neighbors had noticed strange things going on, and that place was raided, and they were arrested, including Letty, the young woman who was running this place. So then the Germans arranged for a Dutch guy to pretend that he was sympathetic to the underground, and that he had a way of arranging for Letty to be sprung free, but it was going to cost some money to grease some palms. And they had a big debate within the group, should they go along with this or not? And ultimately the decision was that yes, they would go for it and pay the 5,000 guilders that was involved. And Wil Westerwelle, even though she was against the plan, volunteered to be the one to go to this meeting place. Well, it was a trap. And the guy who did this was an agent provocateur sent by the Germans. I only know his first name, Karel. I don't know what his last name was. So, they had opportunities like that, and they took advantage of them, and they were clever. And sometimes, the group was just desperate to achieve something, and they took risks, and sometimes they worked out, and sometimes they did not. Sometimes the addresses just became unsafe because neighbors noticed something, and some would not say anything, and others would say something. So.
Absolutely. And that's, I think especially it is fascinating to hear a little bit more about, in the Netherlands, and just the depth of these resistance networks. And, I do wonder, why do you think the Netherlands is such a unique example of widespread resistance during the Holocaust? And you did touch on that, but just, what do you think is the unique?
So it's kind of interesting. Initially, the Netherlands had a fantastic reputation as being one of the great countries where the Dutch really were tremendously helpful. And then someone twigged to the statistic that of all the countries in the West, the loss among Dutch Jewry was actually the highest percentage, because 75% of all Jews in the Netherlands at the time of the occupation, of the 140,000, 106,000 perished, which is 75%. In France, only about a quarter of the 280,000 people who were there, the Jews who were there, were lost. So all of a sudden the reputation became the Dutch were the worst. No, they were not, and they weren't necessarily the best. But here's a statistic that's interesting. Since Yad Vashem started recognizing these righteous among the nations, these non-Jews who helped, Yad Vashem has recognized about 28,000 non-Jewish rescuers. Of those, the largest single national group are the Poles, 7,200 in round numbers. Of them were Poles, which is quite amazing. But the number is also undoubtedly an understatement, because in Poland, how do you become one of the righteous recognized by Yad Vashem? If a survivor went to Yad Vashem and said, I survived because so-and-so hid me or transported me or did whatever. Well, 91% of all Jews in Poland perished. So there were a lot of people who might have been helped along the way, but nobody was there to testify for them after the war. In any case, in Holland was the second largest population of righteous among the nation, with about 6,000. out of 1/4 of the population in Poland. So there is something in the Dutch culture that is special. So it's a long answer to your question, but the thing that I've identified is that Holland has a long tradition of looking at people not in terms of who they are, but what they do. So you could be Jewish, you can be Catholic, you can be Protestant. I don't care about that. And the same was true already, you know, when I grew up, people who were gay, that was nothing in particular. When I came to North America, that was still very badly stigmatized. Fortunately, that has changed a lot since then, since I came to Canada. But in Holland, that was a non-issue. The question was, how do you behave? What do you do? Are you honorable? Do you keep your deals? You can be who you are. So it was. I hate to use the word tolerant. It gets bandied about a lot because it suggests that there is something that needs to be tolerated. And I don't like that aspect of the word. But in fact, it is a very inclusive society traditionally.
Thank you so much. And yes, I appreciate you bringing the nuance to that, you know, there's a lot of different ways to measure how, you know, how each country did, you know, treat its Jewish population. And we have a lot of amazing comments and some more questions in the chat as well. So from Dan Mello, what was your favorite type of farming in Israel? Picking cherry tomatoes or planting cauliflower?
Oh, I'll go for the cherry tomatoes anytime. Those cauliflowers planting there down on the ground, that was pretty tough going. But anyway, we got through it. Yeah,
fair enough.
Yeah, it was great. So anyway,
fantastic. And I'm just there are some beautiful comments. Just thanking you for your story and the fact that indifference is dangerous. That is so true. And the, you know, courage and humanity that you've expressed through your testimony is I think something valuable. And yeah, so I'm just going to read through a little bit more here. And yes, you are a hero. I agree. I think as Carol Grusin has just said in the comments. Monica Simon says, thank you, Guido. Great story, excellent presentation, and inspirational for the young. And Karen Perlmutter, Guido, it is a pleasure listening to your talk. As you know, my family is so grateful to your father and the Westerville group for helping to hide my father and save his life. Beautiful. Thank you so much for sharing that. And thank you. We also we have from Joni that her father was serving in Holland during the war and was impressed with the school children there. And oh, that's a beautiful, beautiful comment. Thank you. And oh, interesting comment as well, a connection to, you know, deeper into our history that Holland actually welcomed Spanish Jewish people during the Inquisition.
That's correct. That's how the bulk of the Jewish population originally got to be in the Netherlands when they were unwelcome in Spain and Portugal. And the largest synagogue in Amsterdam is actually the Portuguese synagogue. Oh, and we celebrated Yom Kippur there last September, actually, as it turns out.
Wow. Oh, amazing. And, you know, thank you so much, everyone who's been on the call today. Guido, maybe one last question, just, you know, especially, I believe, you know, your father was recognized as righteous among the nations in 1964. Is that correct?
That's correct.
How did that feel for you as a young man? And you sort of touched on this of, you know, growing up surrounded by these incredible, courageous figures. So what was that like for you?
So on the one hand, of course, pride is a tricky word. I mean, it doesn't redound to anything to me, but you know, pride in what they did for sure. Grateful for the opportunity to grow up with these aunts and uncles and with a father who was very, very special. There's a funny burden for people in the second generation. That's always the question in the back of your mind. What would I have done? And more than that, what would I have done without the example? Because if something similar were to present itself today, you know, I could lean on the example that generation provided, but they didn't have such an example because this was all brand new. But I was just awestruck by these people. But here's an interesting little bit of an anecdote. So yes, my father was recognized along with the group in 1964 the first time. And then for reasons that I don't know, but 3 of the members of the group were recognized separately in 1987. And one of the three was my father. And so I went over to Israel to be there for that ceremony in Yad Vashem. And one of the young ladies who had been in Loosdrecht, who my father actually managed to save 3 times, she got up and spoke about Jan and how he was wonderful and supportive and how we helped him and so on and so forth. And my father had not really intended to talk because he was a very modest man, as all of them were, quite frankly. But something she said triggered something in his mind. And so at the end of it, he did get up and he said he did want to say something. And he said, yes, that's how it started. We were helping you. But then that fell away and we became friends. And now our children are friends. And even some of our grandchildren are friends. And that's what this medal is for. And there wasn't a dry eye in the room. Now let me end, if I can, with the slogan that is very much typifying the feeling in Israel together. B'yachad nenatzeh, together we will win.
Beautiful.
I think the Zoom session.
Yes, I think someone has accidentally shared, and I was just trying to figure out how to remove that, but
okay.
That's okay. It's not a big deal. That's technology for you, right?
Yeah, not a problem.
No, but thank you. Thank you so much, Guido. It is, again, truly an honor. And I'm going to be reflecting on, the nuances, the eloquence with which you shared the courage of both resistors and survivors of this terrible time.
Okay.
Thank you so much.
And thank you to everyone for being there. Thank you. We'll talk soon. Take care.
Absolutely.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye. Thank you so much, everyone. Have a great evening.